I thought it was just another dull afternoon, until I saw him. The day had started without promise, the kind of afternoon when the entire town seemed to be moving in slow motion beneath a heavy quilt of low-hanging clouds. The air was damp, filled with the metallic scent of rain that hadn't yet begun to fall, but hung in the atmosphere like a promise you couldn't quite trust. Even the neon-red pharmacy sign, which usually flickered with stubborn brightness, appeared muted under the weight of the gray sky. I had walked there without hurry, my mind occupied with a mental list of small obligations, the need to refill my prescription, the thought of what I might prepare for dinner, the quiet calculation of how many days remained before the next paycheck arrived. Inside, the pharmacy felt warmer, but not in a way that offered comfort. The artificial light from the overhead panels cast a pale, flat glow over shelves stacked with bottles and boxes, each promising relief for one ailment or another. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and paper receipts. I joined the line at the counter, letting my gaze drift without focus, until a movement ahead of me caught my attention. An elderly man stood at the register, his back slightly bent, the thin fabric of his coat worn shiny at the elbows, a small fray unraveling at the cuff. His hands, which protruded from the sleeves like branches stripped bare in winter, trembled as he reached deep into the pocket of his coat. When his fingers emerged, they cradled a handful of coins, copper, silver, and a few tarnished edges that glinted under the light as he began to count them, slowly, onto the glass counter. The sound was strangely loud, each coin landing with a metallic chime that seemed to echo through the otherwise hushed pharmacy. One by one they formed a small pile, his voice murmuring the amounts as though speaking them aloud would somehow make them add up to more. But the pile was small, and the pharmacist's expression told me the result even before she spoke. "I'm sorry, sir, but you're still short," she said, her tone polite but flattened by repetition. The man blinked at her, a slight hesitation in his gaze as if he hadn't heard correctly. I thought I had enough," he replied softly, the words carrying an apology that made my chest tighten. He lowered his eyes, studying the coins as though willing them to multiply, his fingers shifting them around as though a hidden dollar might suddenly appear beneath the pile. Behind him, the line began to fray with irritation. A man in a faded baseball cap let out a long, deliberate sigh, making sure everyone could hear. A woman glanced at her watch with an exaggerated motion, her foot tapping a rapid, impatient rhythm against the floor. The air in the room grew heavier, not with heat, but with the quiet pressure of disapproval pressing against the man's fragile posture. It was then, cutting through that oppressive moment, that I heard my mother's voice in my mind, clear, steady, the same as it had been in my childhood. Kindness is never wasted. It was not advice she gave often, but when she did, it stuck, a truth that seemed to resonate louder when the world tried to drown it out. I felt my hand moving before the thought fully formed. Stepping out of the line, I approached the counter, my wallet already in my hand. "I'll cover it," I said, my voice low but firm enough to leave no room for argument. The pharmacist's eyes flicked to mine, relief softening her expression. "That's very kind of you," she murmured, already ringing up the balance. The elderly man turned toward me, surprise and disbelief flickering across his lined face. His eyes, framed by the fine webbing of age, were pale but deep, the kind of eyes that seemed to have watched decades pass by. "You don't have to," he began, his voice trembling. "I know," I interrupted gently, "but I want to." He held my gaze for a long moment, as though searching for the reason behind my choice, before nodding slowly. His lips pressed together, holding back whatever words might have followed, and instead he accepted the small paper bag from the pharmacist. He held it close, both hands wrapped around it like a treasure, and whispered, "Thank you." I offered a small smile, almost embarrassed by the weight in his tone, and stepped aside so he could leave. I told myself it was nothing, just a small kindness, the sort you extend without expecting anything in return. But as I turned toward the door, Something about his eyes stayed with me, a flicker of something I couldn't quite name. Outside, the world had shifted while I was inside. The first thin drops of rain had begun to fall, dotting the pavement in uneven patterns. The air was cooler now, the clouds darker, pulling the horizon closer. I adjusted my coat and began walking toward the street. But that's when I saw it. A sleek black car parked near the curb. It wasn't the kind of vehicle you usually saw in this part of town. Its paint gleamed even in the muted light, reflecting the stormy sky like a pool of midnight. The design was sharp, deliberate, with the kind of understated luxury that spoke of wealth without needing to shout it. I might have kept walking, but my gaze lingered, drawn by something I couldn't quite explain. The driver's seat was empty, the door closed. My eyes shifted to the rear, where the windows were tinted dark enough to hide the interior. And yet, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I slowed, my footsteps splashing lightly against the damp pavement, and that was when the glass began to move. The rear window lowered, slowly, almost theatrically, until a narrow gap revealed what lay inside. A pair of eyes met mine. They were sharp, assessing, their color indeterminate in the dim light, but their focus unyielding. There was no warmth in them, but neither was there coldness, just an intensity that made it impossible to look away. It was the kind of gaze that seemed to peel back layers, searching for something beneath the surface. I froze, the rain beginning to slide down my hair, tracing cold lines along my cheek. Time seemed to stretch between us, the sounds of the street fading into the distance. Those eyes didn't blink, didn't shift, as though they were memorizing me in that moment. And then, just as slowly as it had opened, the window rose again, sealing away the mystery inside the polished black frame. I stood there for a heartbeat longer, my pulse unsteady, before forcing myself to turn and walk away. The rain fell harder now, each drop striking the pavement with a steady rhythm, but my mind was far from the weather. I had no name for the man in that car, no reason to believe I would ever see him again. Yet even as I reached the end of the street, I knew, deep down in that quiet place where intuition lives, that this was not the end. That somehow, paying for a stranger's medicine had pulled me into something far larger, something I could neither predict nor control. The tinted window lowers just enough for me to see a sharp, assessing gaze, a gaze I would come to know far too well. Some strangers disappear from your memory. He refused to leave mine. For days after that rainy afternoon at the pharmacy, his face lingered in my mind, like the echo of a song you can't quite place. I would catch myself thinking about the way his hands trembled when he counted those coins, the way his voice caught as he told me I didn't have to help. It wasn't pity I felt, exactly. It was something more complicated, something that hovered between curiosity and an unspoken recognition I couldn't name. I tried to dismiss it as a fleeting moment, the kind that happens in small towns where even the smallest acts stand out in memory. Yet, no matter how I tried to bury the image of him beneath my daily routines, it surfaced again and again. In the quiet moments before sleep, I'd see those pale, searching eyes. At the grocery store, I'd catch myself scanning the aisles as if he might be there. It was irrational, but I couldn't help it. One evening, sitting in the corner booth of a small cafe that smelled faintly of roasted coffee and cinnamon, I told my best friend Hannah about him. She listened with her chin propped on one hand, eyes wide with a mix of interest and mischief. "So let me get this straight," she said, stirring her latte absent-mindedly. "You bought medicine for an old man, and now you can't stop thinking about him?" I groaned, leaning back in my chair. "Not like that. It's just, there was something about him, something different." Her grin widened. "Maybe he's a secret billionaire testing people's kindness." I laughed, shaking my head. "In this town." He looked like he barely had enough to get home. "Exactly," she said, winking. "That's how the twist always goes in. Movies you'll find out he owns half the city, and you're his long-lost heir or something." We both laughed, but as her words hung in the air, I felt a strange flicker inside me. Not belief exactly, but the faintest whisper of possibility. I pushed it aside, telling myself it was just Hannah's flair for drama rubbing off on me. A week passed, and life resumed its familiar rhythm. Work, errands, quiet evenings. The encounter began to blur at the edges, like a photograph left in the sun too long. Still there, but fading. Then, one ordinary afternoon, I found myself passing by the pharmacy again. I had a prescription to pick up, but if I was honest with myself, that wasn't the only reason I stopped in. The bell above the door chimed softly as I stepped inside. The air was cool, carrying the same faint antiseptic scent as before. I joined the short line at the counter, my eyes scanning the shelves without focus. And then, I saw him. He was standing near the front, not at the counter this time, but off to the side, speaking quietly to someone. The worn coat was gone, replaced by a neatly pressed jacket that fit his frame with understated elegance. His posture was straighter, his movements deliberate, and there was no sign of the small tremor in his hands that I remembered so vividly. Beside him stood a man in a dark tailored suit, the kind of suit that looked like it had been cut to measure in a room with thick carpets and quiet conversation. His hair was neatly styled, his shoes shined to a mirror gloss. But what caught my attention wasn't his appearance. It was the way he carried himself, the subtle alertness in his stance, the way his eyes moved around the room with precise, almost clinical attention. He wasn't just standing there. He was scanning. I tried to be discreet, pretending to browse a nearby display, but the suited man's gaze slid past me, then returned and held for just a fraction of a second. Something about the look made my pulse quicken, not in fear exactly, but in the sense that I had just been quietly assessed and catalogued. The elderly man noticed me then. His expression shifted, not to surprise or joy, but to something quieter, heavier, as though my presence here wasn't unexpected, yet still significant. He murmured something to the suited man, who nodded once before stepping away from him. I turned toward the shelves, pretending to read the label on a bottle of cough syrup, but I could feel the suited man approaching. His footsteps were unhurried, confident, the sound muffled by the pharmacy's thin carpet. When he stopped beside me, his presence was almost tangible, a faint scent of expensive cologne mingling with the sharper scent of disinfectant in the air. "Miss." His voice was low, smooth, carrying the kind of calm authority that made you instinctively listen. I looked up, meeting his eyes. They were as unreadable as they had been from across the room. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and withdrew a thick white envelope. It was heavy, the flap sealed, my name written on the front in elegant handwriting that looked like it belonged on an invitation. "This is for you," he said simply, offering it without explanation. I didn't take it right away. My mind spun through possibilities. A letter? Money? Some elaborate thank you card? I glanced past him toward the elderly man, who was watching us with an expression I couldn't decipher, his hands clasped in front of him. "What is it?" I asked quietly. The suited man's lips curved just slightly, not quite a smile. "You'll find out soon enough." He placed the envelope into my hands before I could protest, his fingers brushing briefly against mine. Not accidentally, I thought. And then he stepped back. By the time I turned to ask another question, he had already returned to the elderly man, who gave me one last, lingering look before they both walked out of the pharmacy together. I stood there for a long moment, the envelope warm against my palm, my heart beating far too quickly for such a simple object. It was absurd, I told myself. People don't just hand out mysterious envelopes to strangers in pharmacies, not in real life. And yet, here I was, holding one. The suited man walks toward me, his eyes fixed, holding a thick white envelope that will change everything. I'd never been invited to a world I didn't belong to, until that night. It started with a single envelope that felt heavier than paper and ink should ever feel. From the moment it touched my hands, I knew my ordinary life had shifted on its axis. I kept the envelope on my kitchen table as if it were a small animal that might dart away if I looked at it too directly, circling it with nervous glances while I boiled water for tea I barely touched, while the room settled into the hush of early evening, while the light outside slid from lemon to amber to a blue that made everything inside feel like a stage set waiting for its actors. The paper was thick and ivory, with a faint sheen like pressed silk. My name curled across the front in a hand that was neither casual nor performative, simply precise, as if the writer had never learned to do anything imprecisely in his life. I could still feel the earlier brush of the suited man's fingers when he placed it in my palm at the pharmacy, polite, brief, entirely certain. And the memory made my heartbeat toss against my ribs in a rhythm that didn't feel like fear, but not exactly like excitement either, something between the two. A current that wanted to pull me forward even as the sensible part of me wanted to plant my feet and refuse. When Hannah arrived, letting herself in with the soft knock that meant we were each other's nearest shore, she saw the envelope before she saw me. "So," she said, placing her bag on a chair and leaning over the table like a detective about to interrogate a clue. "We're doing secrets now?" I told her everything. The fragile man I'd helped, the second sighting where fragility was replaced by something steadier, the shadow of the black car, the head of security with eyes like a measuring instrument, the way the room had tilted when he crossed to me, the envelope heavy as if it contained not paper, but momentum. She listened, expression moving between teasing and concern, the way people do when they want you to be brave, but also to stay safe, when they want a story to be beautiful and for you to keep your heart unbroken. "Open it," she said finally, in the voice she used when we were children, and she dared me to jump from the highest rung of the playground ladder and promised to catch me if I fell. I turned the envelope over slowly, pressing my thumb against the wax seal I hadn't noticed at first, a discreet crest, unfamiliar, a stylized key woven through a laurel, and as the seal gave with a soft snap, I felt something in me give too, that little knot of resistance that keeps us inside the boundaries of the life we already understand. The card inside was thick enough to cast its own shadow. The lettering, the same precise hand, read, "You are cordially invited to dinner. Friday, 7 p.m. The Imperial Grand Hotel. Private dining room, 2. Transportation will be provided." A grateful stranger. If the pharmacy had been a stage for small humiliations and accidental grace. The Imperial Grand was built for ceremony, for the performance of power dressed in marble and light. I had never been inside. Most people in our town hadn't. We drove past it sometimes and made up stories about the lives unfolding behind its revolving doors. Women in gowns that moved like water, and men whose shoes clicked on polished floors. Conversations in which decisions were made that would eventually fall like weather across people like us. Reading the name printed there in ink that caught the lamp glow and held it like a flame, I felt simultaneously invited and examined, chosen and tested, as if this were both kindness and question. "This could be wonderful," Hannah said softly, and then, after a beat, "Or it could be something else." She paced once, twice, then stopped, facing me with her hands on my shoulders the way my mother used to do when she wanted to hold me steady, while she told me the truth. "You don't owe anyone anything beyond what you've already given," she said. "You helped a man who needed help, and maybe that's the beginning of something. Or maybe that's the whole story. If you go, go because your instincts are awake and you'll listen to them. If you don't go, don't punish yourself for being careful." I loved her for that, for refusing to push me toward a story just because it had better scenery. I told her I would think. She kissed my forehead and left me to the quiet. I thought, and I paced, and in the end, the simplest thing won. Curiosity, yes, but also a sense of unfinishedness, like walking away from a book when you've read a chapter that rearranged your understanding of the characters, and you need to know if you were right about what you saw in their faces. So, on Friday, I put on the dress I kept for interviews and weddings and grief, the one that didn't announce itself but fit me like a promise that I belonged in rooms I'd never practiced standing in. And I waited by the window as the late afternoon dimmed. At 6:30 on the dot, as if the invitation had become a person, a black car slid against the curb outside my building and came to rest with the silence of machines built to be listened to. The driver wore a suit whose seams were almost invisible and spoke in a voice designed not to startle anyone. He opened the door and said my name like it was the password to an old house. Inside, the car smelled faintly of cedar and something clean that reminded me of rain on stone. The leather held the coolness of shade. The city unwound outside the tinted glass, street by street, the ordinary smudged into gloss as the neighborhoods shifted from our patched sidewalks and painted signs to broad avenues, where the trees were as manicured as the people, and where the light seemed to have been trained to fall gracefully. I watched my reflection in the window, overlaid with buildings I'd never entered, and tried not to be embarrassed by the smallness of my life pressing itself up against this larger one, like a hand against glass. The Imperial Grand was the kind of place that insisted on capital letters. Even its driveway performed, sweeping in a perfect arc beneath a portico supported by columns that would have been ridiculous if they weren't so exact. Uniformed valets moved with choreographed discretion, and the lobby beyond the revolving doors bloomed into space, a ceiling painted with a sky more patient than the real one, chandeliers like clusters of captured stars, marble floors carrying the reflections of people who had mastered the art of appearing unhurried. Somewhere a pianist coaxed a quiet river of notes from a grand piano. The sound found my spine and smoothed it. A concierge met me with my name already on his tongue and escorted me through corridors that smelled faintly of beeswax and citrus, past paintings whose subjects looked as if they'd been considering their own importance for centuries, to a pair of double doors that opened on a whisper. Private Dining Room 2 was smaller than the lobby, but larger than any room I had eaten in. Linen like snowfall lay across the table. Silver gleaned from old rituals lined the place settings, and candlelight rose steady and white from tall holders so polished they seemed like careful water. He was there already, standing as I entered, the elderly man I had first known as a trembling need at a counter, now wearing a suit whose cut wasted no fabric and granted him not youth, but presence. "I'm glad you came," he said, not as a host reassured that a guest had honored an invitation, but as a man relieved that a choice he'd made had not betrayed him. His voice was deeper than I remembered, with a steadiness that belonged to someone who had steadied other people. I wanted to ask 100 questions at once, and also none at all, just to let this unfolding take its time the way the best stories do. I sat when he gestured, and a server appeared, silent as a thought you haven't decided to speak, pouring water that caught the light, and held it, like a tame jewel. We talked first about small things, because that is the custom humans invented, to see if the air will hold them. The rain that had come at last, and rinsed the streets clean for a night. The piano music that loosened something in the chest. The beauty of rooms built to testify to the people who could afford to sit inside them. Yet beneath those small things was a thread I could feel, but not name. An intention that ran under the table between us like a quiet electricity. He asked if the medicine had helped. I said I hoped so, and waited for an explanation he did not yet offer. He said it had been a hard week for him, and that what I'd done had made it less so. I said it had been a hard month for me, in the way that months can be hard, without drama, full of small worries that know your address by heart, and that doing the right thing had felt like the first, uncomplicated decision I'd made in days. The food arrived, carried by hands trained never to interrupt a sentence at the wrong place. Delicate things arranged with the certainty of geometry, flavors nested inside other flavors, each bite designed to suggest that care itself, when focused and funded, can become edible. I ate because my body remembered to, but my mind was occupied with his face, which seemed to carry two lives at once, the one I'd first seen, the one of thinness and apology, and another that belonged in rooms like this, with a jaw that knew decisions and eyes that had learned to count costs invisible to accountants. When he smiled, it reached his eyes without erasing their calculation, as if generosity and strategy, in him, were not opposites but siblings who had learned to share a house. At last, because at last always comes, either because someone allows it or because it forces its way in, the plates were cleared and the room retreated to candlelight and music and the breath between us. He leaned forward slightly, the linen barely creasing beneath his forearms, and looked at me, not with gratitude, now, but with recognition, the kind reserved for someone who has walked into a story without knowing she was the missing character. I felt the air grow thicker, not unpleasantly, the way it does moments before rain that will change the temperature of everything it touches. "You have no idea who I am," he said, and the sentence was neither boast nor accusation. It was an observation made with the tenderness of a surgeon who names the wound so he can begin to heal it. "But you will." The word settled in my chest like a key laid gently into a lock that had been waiting, patient and silent, for a hand to turn it. A tremor of anticipation, bright and uneasy, moved through me as the room seemed to lean in and listen with us. And in that suspended moment, I understood that whatever truth followed would not fit back inside the life I had brought to this table. The man I thought I'd helped was about to rewrite my entire life story. For a moment after his cryptic statement, we both just sat there in the warm glow of the candlelight, letting his words settle like dust in an abandoned room. The clinking of silverware and the muffled piano from outside faded, replaced by a stillness that seemed to draw the air tighter around us. I didn't know if he was about to tell me something wonderful or dangerous, but every instinct in me said that whatever came next would change everything. He leaned back slightly, studying me with the same assessing gaze I had first seen from the tinted car window. "I wanted to thank you," he began, his voice measured but deep enough to cut through the quiet, "for paying for my medicine that day." I tried to smile, brushing it off. It was nothing. Really, anyone would have done it. His eyes narrowed just a fraction, as though I'd said something he'd heard before, but didn't believe. "No," he said firmly. "It wasn't nothing. And not everyone would have done it. What you saw as a small act, I saw as a turning point. That made me pause. A turning point for what?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he picked up his glass, letting the candlelight catch on the rim. "I wasn't at that pharmacy by accident," he said. "I've been testing the kindness of strangers." I blinked, unsure if I'd heard him right. "Testing?" "Yes," he said simply. "It's something I do from time to time. I step out of my usual life, away from the people who know my name or my resources, and I place myself in situations that strip all of that away. No assistance, no money in my pocket, just me and the kindness, or indifference, of those I meet." It took me a second to process that. "So, that day, you weren't actually—" He held up a hand, not to silence me, but to slow the rush of assumptions. "I wasn't acting. The circumstances were real. The medicine was needed. But I could have paid for it 100 times over. What mattered to me was seeing who would step forward, and why." I sat back, unsure how to feel. Part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Part of me felt a sting of having been unknowingly part of an experiment. And another part was oddly relieved that he wasn't as fragile as I'd feared. "So what did you find?" I asked finally. A small smile tugged at his mouth. "I found you." The way he said it made the room feel smaller, more intimate, as if we were the only two people in a world that was suddenly paying attention. I didn't know whether to feel flattered or wary, but I couldn't look away from him. The door to the private dining room opened briefly, and the sharply dressed man from the pharmacy stepped inside. He moved with quiet precision, speaking in low tones to the older man before taking up position just outside the door again. "That's your assistant?" I asked, nodding toward him. He chuckled lightly. "Not exactly. He's my head of security." I raised an eyebrow. "Security? For a pharmacy trip?" "For life," he corrected calmly. "Some people require it." That answer only deepened the mystery. Suddenly, I was replaying the black luxury car, the tinted windows, the calculating eyes. It all made sense in a way, and yet it didn't. Who was this man? The waiter arrived with our main course, perfectly cooked steak for him, a delicate salmon for me. But my appetite had vanished under the weight of questions. He waited until the waiter had left before speaking again. "I imagine you're wondering why I invited you here tonight." "That crossed my mind," I said dryly. "Because," he said, leaning forward, "what happened at that pharmacy told me everything I needed to know about you. You didn't just see someone struggling, you acted. Without hesitation. Without calculation. That's rare." I shifted uncomfortably in my chair. "It was just a moment." "There are no just moments," he said softly. "Only moments that change the course of things, for better or worse." We ate slowly, the conversation moving between the surface, travel, the food, the city, and the deep water underneath, where his words carried the weight of something unspoken. He told me little pieces of his life, though never enough to form a complete picture. He'd built something big. A company, a vision, a responsibility, he said. And that success had come with both rewards and dangers. The security, the privacy, the careful selection of who to trust. It all made sense now. Still, I couldn't help asking, "So, who are you, really?" For a moment, he just looked at me, his eyes searching mine as if deciding whether I was ready for the answer. Then he placed his knife and fork neatly on his plate, folded his napkin, and said, "My name is Adrian Wolfe." The name hit me like a jolt. I had heard it before, not in a passing conversation, but in headlines. I'd seen it attached to stories about billion-dollar deals, about philanthropy, about a man whose face appeared in business magazines and whose voice commanded rooms full of investors. Adrian Wolfe, CEO, visionary, powerhouse. And now he was sitting across from me, speaking like this dinner was the most important meeting of his life. My mind scrambled to connect the fragile man in the pharmacy with the titan of industry from the news. I've read about you," I said slowly. "I know," he replied, almost gently. "And now you'll understand why that day, and you, mattered more than you realize." He sat back, his gaze steady and unreadable. "In a few days," he said, "I'm going to make you an offer that will change your life forever." And in that moment, I knew, whatever game I'd stepped into, I was already too deep to walk away. My act of kindness had been toward one of the most powerful men in the country. The truth didn't just surprise me. It rewrote everything I thought I knew about him. And I realized the evening was only just beginning. For a long beat after revealing his other name, he let me sit with it. Adrian Wolfe, the alias, was already intimidating enough. But when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a deliberate weight. "My real name," he said, "is Alexander Cole." It took half a second for the recognition to hit. Alexander Cole, the billionaire CEO behind Cole International, one of the largest pharmaceutical empires in the world. His company's logo was printed on medicine bottles in almost every pharmacy I'd ever been in. His name had been in headlines for years, some praising him as a visionary, others scrutinizing his business deals. And now that same man was sitting across from me in a private dining room, thanking me for buying him medicine. I could feel my brows furrow as the irony landed. "Wait, so the medicine I bought for you was made by my company," he finished with a small nod. "In one of our labs, under our patent." I could have bought the pharmacy itself if I'd wanted to. But that day, it wasn't about money. He rested his hands lightly on the table, his eyes steady on mine. That day was about something else, entirely. I didn't speak, letting him fill the silence. Years ago, he said quietly, I lost my wife. A car accident, instant. No warning. One moment she was there, the next she was gone. The sound of the piano outside the room seemed to soften, the air itself thickening around us. His words were simple, but they carried the kind of grief that never leaves. It only changes shape. She was the kindest person I ever knew, he continued. She had this gift, this ability to notice people who were invisible to the rest of the world. She believed in helping strangers, not because she expected anything in return, but because she felt their need before they asked. She used to say that kindness was the only currency that never devalued. I could picture her. Warm eyes, an easy smile, someone who saw the good in people before they saw it in themselves. And I could imagine how losing her would feel like having the sun pulled out of your sky. The anniversary of her death is always difficult, he said. So I honor her, in the only way I know how. Every year, on that day, I put myself in a position where I need help. No titles, no introductions, just a man, vulnerable, waiting to see if anyone will notice. I leaned back, absorbing it. So I was part of this ritual? He nodded. Yes, and I should tell you, not everyone passes the test. Some look away. Some decide they're too busy. Some, well, they choose not to see. And I don't judge them. Life makes people hard. But once in a while, someone steps forward. And when they do, I remember why my wife believed so strongly in people? There was a pause, and his gaze didn't waver. You didn't just help me. You didn't even ask why I needed help. You acted, instantly, and that tells me more about you than you realize. I swallowed, my throat tight. It was just what anyone would do. His head tilted slightly. No, it was what you would do, and that's the difference. The waiter reappeared briefly to refill our glasses, but my focus didn't leave him. I was trying to reconcile the man in front of me, powerful, untouchable, with the fragile figure I'd seen in the pharmacy. And in a strange way, I realized both were equally real. When I saw you walk toward me that day, he said, you reminded me of her. The way she used to move toward people, not away from them. And I knew I wanted to see you again. I shook my head slightly, still processing. But why tell me all this now? You could have just thanked me and left it at that. He smiled faintly. Because I'm going to repay you. And I don't want you to mistake my intention. This isn't charity. This isn't me trying to balance a debt. This is me choosing you for something that matters. The weight of his words settled over me, heavier than I expected. I wasn't sure whether to be intrigued or unsettled. And what exactly does that mean? You'll know soon enough, he said, his tone quiet but certain. It was maddening, the mix of answers and non-answers. But there was something about his composure, the way he measured each sentence, that made me believe he wasn't playing games. This wasn't about power for its own sake. This was personal. I thought of his wife, of the life they must have shared before tragedy broke it in two. And I thought of the fact that my small act of kindness had somehow pulled me into the orbit of a man who could change lives with a single decision. Outside the room, I could hear the faint sound of footsteps, the head of security, no doubt, keeping watch. It was a reminder that this world he lived in was not mine. And yet, tonight, he'd opened the door to it. His gaze softened as he leaned back. You don't have to decide anything tonight. But I want you to remember something. Some opportunities don't knock twice. I exhaled slowly, unsure whether to feel grateful or wary. So, what happens now? He smiled, just enough to show he'd been waiting for that question. Now, he said, I begin keeping my promise. His voice lowered, carrying a weight that felt like both a gift and a challenge. "I'm going to repay you," he said, "in a way you can't even imagine." And in that moment I knew. I was already too far in to walk away. I thought I knew what wealth looked like. I was wrong. I'd seen it in magazines, on TV, in glossy ads that made success look like a photograph. But stepping into Alexander Cole's world made me realize I'd never really understood its scale. The morning after our dinner, I was still replaying his words when I heard a soft knock at my door. I opened it to find a man in a crisp black suit standing beside a long, sleek limousine that seemed to absorb the light. The car wasn't just polished. It looked like it had been hand-detailed an hour ago. "Miss," the driver said, inclining his head respectfully, "Mr. Cole has asked me to bring you to his office." There was no question in his tone, only quiet certainty, as though my answer had already been decided. I grabbed my coat, slid into the car, and immediately felt swallowed by luxury. The interior was spacious, the leather impossibly soft, and a faint scent of cedar and something rarer lingered in the air. We drove through the city, the familiar streets giving way to districts I'd never had a reason to visit. Towering glass buildings rose like monuments, their mirrored surfaces reflecting the morning sun in blinding shards. Several of them bore the Cole International logo, a sleek silver C entwined with a stylized key. As we pulled into a private entrance, I noticed how seamlessly everything moved here. Security guards greeted the car without needing to be told who I was. Glass doors slid open silently, and I stepped into a lobby that could have been the atrium of a modern art museum. Marble floors, walls of cascading water, and a chandelier made entirely of hanging crystals that shimmered like captured rain. Alexander was already there, waiting for me. Not at a desk, not surrounded by assistants, but standing near the entrance, his posture relaxed yet commanding. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that managed to be both understated and impossible to ignore. "Good morning," he said warmly, as though this were the most ordinary of meetings. "I thought you might want to see where I spend my time." We walked together through the building, and I quickly realized that this wasn't just a workplace. It was an empire. Every floor we passed had its own atmosphere, one filled with sleek labs where scientists moved with quiet precision, another with open-plan offices buzzing with coordinated energy, another that looked more like a think tank, walls covered in interactive screens full of market data and project timelines. Employees greeted him with subtle nods or a quiet "Mr. Cole," but their eyes flicked to me with curiosity. A few smiled. Others seemed to be politely pretending not to wonder why I was there. At one point, we passed a corridor where the walls were lined with photographs, images of him with world leaders, humanitarian projects, award ceremonies. But nestled among them were candid shots that caught my attention. Alexander laughing with a group of children, Alexander planting a tree, Alexander standing in the rain holding an umbrella over someone else. He noticed my gaze. "Those aren't for PR," he said quietly. "They're reminders. Success doesn't mean anything if you forget why you built it." We reached a large set of double doors, guarded by 2 security staff. When they opened, I stepped into a boardroom so vast it could have doubled as a ballroom. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, and a polished table stretched nearly the entire length of the room. Around it sat more than a dozen people, executives in tailored suits, some flipping through documents, others glancing up as we entered. Alexander didn't pause. He walked straight to the head of the table, gestured for me to join him, and said with calm authority, "Everyone, this is the woman who saved my life." Every head turned toward me. For a moment, the weight of their collective attention was overwhelming. I felt my cheeks warm, unsure what to do with my hands. But then I caught the faint smile at the corner of Alexander's mouth, and something in his expression told me this wasn't a setup. It was a statement. One of the board members, a silver-haired man with sharp eyes, asked, "Saved your life?" Alexander's gaze stayed steady on me. Yes, in more ways than one. The room went still. Whatever unspoken story he wasn't sharing, it was clear they all respected him enough not to press for details. We stayed for the meeting, which was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was efficient, controlled. Every decision weighed like a chess move. Alexander listened more than he spoke, but when he did speak, the room shifted with his words. Deals were discussed, strategies adjusted, and I watched as he navigated the flow of power as easily as most people navigate a sidewalk. Afterward, as the board members filed out, a few stopped to shake my hand. Their politeness was genuine, but there was something else in their eyes, a quiet acknowledgement that if Alexander Cole valued me, I must be worth noticing. We left the boardroom, the elevator carrying us down past the glass floors and the hum of controlled ambition. "I wanted you to see this," he said, "because if you choose to be part of my world, you need to know what it looks like, the good and the bad." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I'd seen any of the bad yet. Everything here seemed orchestrated to impress. When we reached the lobby, I thought we might be done for the day. But Alexander turned toward the waiting limousine, his tone casual, but his eyes carrying that same unreadable depth. "There's one last place I want to take you," he said. I stepped into the car, curiosity prickling like static along my skin. If this was how he introduced me to his public world, I couldn't imagine what he planned to show me next. And yet, I had the distinct feeling it was going to matter even more. Never in my life had I been handed the keys to a dream. I'd imagined winning the lottery, stumbling into a windfall, even fantasy scenarios of finding an envelope stuffed with cash. But nothing could have prepared me for this. The limousine's smooth hum carried us out of the city, past glass towers and busy streets, into quieter, greener landscapes. I watched the skyline shrink in the distance, replaced by winding roads flanked with manicured hedges and tall iron gates. Each turn seemed to lift us higher until the air itself felt different, fresher, cooler, touched by the scent of pine and something faintly floral. Finally, the car slowed before a set of ornate, wrought iron gates. They swung open without pause, as if someone had been watching for our arrival. Beyond them stretched a long driveway, lined with lanterns and ancient oaks, whose branches arched overhead, like a cathedral ceiling. The moment the estate came into view, my breath caught. It wasn't just a mansion, it was an architectural statement. Pale stone walls rose 3 stories high, with sweeping balconies and rows of tall windows reflecting the early afternoon sun. Slate rooftops crowned the structure, and at its center, a grand double staircase led to an entrance framed by carved pillars. The entire property was perched high enough that the view behind it rolled endlessly into the horizon, the city now nothing but a glimmer far below. The car came to a stop before the entrance. Alexander stepped out first, offering his hand to help me onto the circular drive's cobblestones. I turned in a slow circle, taking in the gardens that seemed to go on forever. Rose bushes in perfect bloom, fountains catching the sunlight in arcs of silver, a greenhouse that sparkled like a jewel at the far edge of the lawn. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "This," he said simply, "is yours." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. "Mine?" "Yes." His tone was calm, unshakable, as though he'd just told me the weather forecast. "You can't be serious," I said, shaking my head. This has to be some kind of joke." "It isn't," he replied. "The paperwork is already done. The property is in your name. All of it." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, for the moment he'd tell me it was just a tour, or some elaborate showpiece. But there was no flicker of humor in his eyes, only certainty. "Alexander, I can't accept this. It's too much." He cut me off gently. "Too much for what? For buying me medicine? For being kind when no one else was? You have to understand. This isn't about the cost. This is about what you gave me that day. something I can never truly repay. But I will try. Still dazed, I followed him up the wide staircase and through the massive double doors into an entrance hall that could have belonged to a palace. The ceiling soared high above us, painted with an intricate mural of clouds and light. A chandelier hung like a galaxy of crystals, scattering rainbows across the polished marble floor. This place is... I couldn't find the word. Yours, he said again, almost like a reassurance. We moved through the house, each room more staggering than the last. A library with floor-to-ceiling shelves and a rolling ladder. A kitchen gleaming with brass fixtures and marble counters, the kind you see in cooking magazines. A sunroom filled with plush chairs and glass walls that open to the gardens. Bedrooms with private balconies. Bathrooms tiled in marble and gold. Every detail felt deliberate, chosen with the same care I'd seen him use in the boardroom. "Why me?" I asked again, my voice echoing slightly off the high ceilings. "Because I can," he said simply, "and because I want to." We reached a set of French doors that opened onto the back terrace. From here the view was even more breathtaking. Rolling hills, a winding river far below, the horizon melting into the sky. The wind lifted my hair, carrying the scent of roses and fresh-cut grass. I turned to face him, still struggling to process. "You know, most people would think you're out of your mind." He smiled faintly. "Most people don't understand what it's like to lose something they can never get back. When that happens, you stop measuring generosity in terms of logic. You start measuring it in terms of meaning." We stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me was still waiting to wake up, certain this was all some elaborate dream. "Everything here is fully functional," he said finally. "Staff, security, maintenance. You won't have to lift a finger unless you want to. This home is meant to be lived in, not just looked at." The thought of staff, of strangers moving quietly through the halls, made me uneasy, but the sincerity in his voice made it hard to protest. Inside, we finished the tour in what he called the heart of the house. A circular sitting room with windows on all sides, sunlight spilling in like gold. He gestured toward a small table near the window. On it sat a polished wooden box. "Keys," he said simply. I stepped closer and opened the box. Inside, resting on deep blue velvet, were several ornate keys and a slim engraved card. The inscription was simple: "Welcome home." The sight of it made my chest tighten. This wasn't just a gift. This was a statement, a door opening into a life I had never imagined for myself. I turned to him, still searching for words. "Alexander, I don't know what to say." "Then don't," he said softly. "Just live. That's all I ask." I nodded, though my mind was still spinning. This house, this property, this life. It was too much to take in at once. We left the sitting room, our footsteps echoing faintly in the grand hall. As we stepped, back outside into the sunlight, the keys still in my hand, Alexander glanced at me with an expression that was almost mischievous. "This," he said, "is only the beginning of my repayment." The weight of the keys in my palm felt both thrilling and terrifying. If this was just the beginning, I couldn't begin to imagine what would come next, or what it might cost me in return. His gift wasn't just about me. It was about changing lives. And as I listened to what he wanted next, I realized the mansion was only a doorway. What lay beyond it would demand far more than I'd ever given before. We were still standing on the terrace when Alexander's tone shifted from generosity to something heavier. The breeze carried the faint rustle of leaves from the gardens below, but his voice cut through it with the weight of a man revealing the true reason for an invitation. "You think this house is my repayment?" he said, glancing at the keys still in my hand. "It isn't. It's just a foundation, a place from which you'll build something far greater." I frowned, unsure what he meant. "Build?" He turned, gesturing for me to walk with him down a stone path, that wound through the gardens. "I've been working on an idea for years," he began, "but it needed the right person at its heart. Someone who understands that real change starts with small acts of humanity, like what you did in that pharmacy." The path led us to a quiet gazebo overlooking the hills. He stopped there, resting his hands lightly on the railing. "Your town," he said. "It's good. Hard-working people. But the nearest hospital is 40 minutes away, and even then, not everyone can afford the care they need." I nodded. It was true. I'd seen neighbors delay treatment because they couldn't pay for the appointment, let alone the medication. "I want to build something there," he continued. "A medical center. State-of-the-art, staffed by the best, and entirely free." The words hit me like a wave, powerful, impossible, almost too big to believe. Free. Yes, funded entirely by me. No insurance paperwork, no hidden costs. Anyone who walks through its doors will get the care they need. No questions asked. I stared at him, my mind reeling. "That's incredible. But what does it have to do with me?" He turned toward me fully, his gaze steady. "I want you to oversee it." The shock was immediate. "Me? Alexander, I've never managed anything like that. I don't know the first thing about running a medical center." "You know people," he said simply. "You know what kindness looks like. You know how to listen, how to notice what others miss. Skills like that can't be taught, and they're far rarer than management degrees." I shook my head, half laughing from disbelief. "You could hire 100 people with far more experience." "I could," he said, "but this isn't just about building a facility. It's about building trust, and that has to start with someone who's already earned mine." We sat in the gazebo's shade, and he began outlining his vision in detail. The building's design, the specialists he intended to recruit, the mobile units that would reach rural areas. Every piece of it had been thought through, planned with the same precision I'd seen in his corporate world. But there was a personal edge to it, something raw that the boardroom polish couldn't hide. "This isn't charity for me," he said. "It's a promise. I've built a fortune selling medicine. I can't undo the system, but I can create spaces where it doesn't matter whether someone can pay. Places where lives aren't measured in profit margins." I listened, torn between awe and fear. The project was extraordinary, but the responsibility he was placing on me felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. "What if I fail?" I asked quietly. "Then you'll fail trying to change something that needs changing," he said without hesitation. "And that's a better failure than most people ever attempt." We walked back toward the mansion slowly, the weight of his vision pressing against me. The rose bushes seemed brighter in the afternoon sun, the fountains more vivid, as if the world itself was trying to match the enormity of what he'd just proposed. Inside, we sat in the circular sitting room where the keys still rested in their velvet box. Alexander leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his expression more serious than I'd ever seen it. "This isn't just a project," he said. "It's a commitment. To the people in your town, to yourself, to the memory of why you stepped forward in that pharmacy. If you take this on, you'll be stepping into a fight that will demand every ounce of you. Your patience, your resolve, your courage." I took a deep breath, the reality of it sinking in. The mansion, the luxury, the sudden shift in my life. All of it felt small compared to what he was asking now. "And if I say no?" I asked. "Then I'll find someone else," he said. "But I'll be disappointed, because I think you're the only one who can do it the way it needs to be done." The words weren't manipulative. They were a simple truth, spoken by a man who seemed to know the shape of my strengths before I did. I looked down at the keys again, realizing they weren't just for the mansion. They were for a life I hadn't chosen, but one that was now waiting for me to step into it. Alexander's gaze didn't waver as he spoke the final words of the afternoon. "If you take this on," he said, "it will change you forever." And I knew he wasn't just talking about the work. We weren't just building walls. We were building futures. Every hammer strike echoed with possibility. And I knew, deep down, that what we were creating would outlive us all. The first morning on site, I stood in an open field that had been cleared just days before. Only a week ago, it was overgrown with weeds and wildflowers, the kind of place kids dared each other to run through. Now, it was buzzing with the purposeful chaos of a dream, becoming real. The land wasn't far from my childhood street, yet standing there, I felt worlds away from anything I'd ever known. Heavy machinery rumbled like distant thunder, excavators carving into the earth with methodical precision. Surveyors in orange vests bent over tripods, their measurements snapping the future into place. Architects, their blueprints clipped to boards, waved their arms to explain layouts to crews. Alexander had been right. I didn't need construction experience to feel the weight of what was happening. I just needed to care enough to be present. The first few weeks were a crash course in a language I didn't speak. Concrete curing times, load-bearing walls, HVAC system placements. But I listened, asked questions, and began to piece it together. My notebook filled with sketches, schedules, and the kind of details I'd never imagined I'd find fascinating. Word of the project spread quickly through town. People slowed their cars as they passed the site. Some stopped entirely, leaning against the temporary fencing to watch. It didn't take long before curiosity turned into action. One afternoon, an elderly man in work boots approached me. "I used to do carpentry," he said, his voice carrying the slow confidence of someone who'd built more than a few homes. "Wouldn't mind putting my hands into something that matters before I'm too old to lift a hammer." By the end of that week, he wasn't alone. Volunteers arrived daily, some with decades of skill, others with nothing but enthusiasm. Local restaurants started sending meals to the site for the workers. High school students planted rows of young trees along the planned walking path. It was Alexander's idea to let the town have a hand in the build. If they help build it, they'll feel it's theirs, he told me. And that's the kind of ownership money can't buy. Though he funded the entire initial phase himself, he made no secret of the project's mission. Soon, donations started arriving, sometimes a few crumpled bills in an envelope, sometimes checks with notes like, "For my daughter," so no one else has to wait for care. Each addition to the site brought a new wave of excitement. The day the steel skeleton rose from the ground, people lined the sidewalk to watch. When the first walls went up, children pressed their hands against the fresh wood, leaving invisible imprints on the future. Inside the rising structure, I could already see what it would become. A sunlit reception area, treatment rooms with wide windows, a pediatric wing painted in colors bright enough to chase away fear. There were challenges, too. A supply delay meant critical equipment sat in a warehouse 3 states away for weeks. A sudden storm flooded the lower level of the site, setting us back days. And always, there was the pressure of the clock, the knowledge that people were waiting, needing the care we were still building. But Alexander never let me carry the weight alone. Some days he arrived in his immaculate suit. Other days he showed up in rolled sleeves, lifting boxes or hauling tools. He didn't just talk about the project, he worked in it. "Remember," he told me once as we reviewed the floor plan, "you're not just building a clinic, you're building trust. And that starts now, before the first patient even walks in." Months passed in a blur of progress. By the time winter melted into spring, the building was complete. The silver letters of the sign, Cole Community Medical Center, gleamed above the entrance, catching the morning light. Opening day arrived on a crisp, clear morning. The smell of fresh paint still lingered, mingling with the clean scent of polished floors. Staff bustled about, arranging furniture, double-checking equipment, making sure every detail was in place. I stood at the glass doors, looking out at the growing crowd. Families, elderly couples, young people curious about the space, all drawn by the promise of something our town had never had before. Alexander appeared beside me, his eyes scanning the scene. "This is what you've done," he said quietly. I wanted to correct him, to say we, But I knew the truth. It wasn't just us. It was everyone who had lifted a hammer, painted a wall, or given what they could. The ribbon was cut, cameras flashed, and the doors opened. People streamed inside, their faces shifting from curiosity to relief as they saw what had been built for them. I was greeting a young mother when the air around me seemed to change. A kind of heaviness, a shift in the current, as though a shadow had moved over the room. From the edge of the crowd, a figure stepped forward. I recognized them instantly, not because they belonged in this new chapter of my life, but because they belonged to a chapter I'd tried hard to close. Our eyes met, and for a heartbeat, the noise of the crowd vanished. They didn't just know my past, they had shaped it. And now, they were walking straight toward me. Some ghosts don't stay buried. They walk right up to you, and when they do, the air changes, like the past itself has stepped into the room. That's exactly how it felt when I saw my father for the first time in 15 years. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was still fresh in my mind. The sound of applause lingered like an echo, and the energy in the medical center was electric. People exploring every room, staff proudly showing off equipment, children running down the corridors laughing. This was the moment I had imagined for months, the one I thought would only be filled with joy. But then the crowd shifted. I didn't see him at first. I only felt it, that subtle shift in the atmosphere, the prickling awareness that someone's eyes were fixed on me. And then I saw him. He stood just beyond the edge of the crowd, framed by the glass doors like a figure caught between stepping in and staying out. His hair was streaked with gray now, thinner than I remembered. His face was sharper, more lined, but still carried the familiar angles I'd once traced with my eyes as a child, trying to memorize every detail. His clothes were clean, but worn, his jacket just a little too big on his frame. But it was the eyes that stopped me. The same restless, piercing blue that had once been so full of life. They locked onto mine, and for a second, time folded in on itself. I hadn't seen my father since the night he left. No goodbye, no explanation. One day he was there, the next he was gone. I'd been 13, standing in the driveway with my mother, trying to make sense of the way his taillights disappeared into the dark. Now he was here, in my medical center, on my day. The noise of the room dimmed in my ears. I took a step toward him, my movement slow, almost unwilling. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice steady but laced with an edge I couldn't hide. A faint smile tugged at his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I heard about this place. Saw your name in the paper. Figured I should see it for myself." I wanted to laugh at the casualness of it, as if we'd just been out of touch for a few months instead of nearly 2 decades. My chest tightened with a dozen emotions at once. Anger, grief, longing, confusion. Alexander must have sensed something shift, because suddenly he was there beside me. His presence was quiet but grounding, the way a strong tree feels when you're in its shade. His eyes moved from me to my father, assessing without judgment, offering silent support. "This is Alexander Cole," I said, the formality in my tone a barrier between me and the storm inside. "He's the one who made this possible." My father gave him a short nod, but didn't look away from me. "You've done well," he said. The words hit harder than they should have. Part of me wanted to snap back. "You don't get to say that." Another part of me, the child who once waited by the window for him to come home, wanted to drink them in. But I kept my face still. "You don't know me anymore," I replied. His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small. "I brought you this," he said, holding it out. It was a photograph, worn at the edges, the colors faded to a warm sepia. My breath caught as I looked at it. Me, maybe 7 or 8 years old, standing in front of a small house I could barely remember. I was grinning, gap-toothed, holding a stuffed rabbit in one hand. My father stood behind me, one hand resting on my shoulder, both of us squinting into the sun. I flipped it over. On the back, in his cramped handwriting, were 4 words. "She didn't tell you." My eyes snapped up to his. "What does this mean?" He glanced briefly at Alexander, then back at me. "Not here," he said quietly. "Not now." A surge of frustration rose in my chest. "If you came all this way just to play games—" "This isn't a game," he interrupted, his voice suddenly firm. "It's the truth. And you deserve to know it." The firmness in his tone made something shift inside me. Not trust exactly, but a flicker of the belief I'd once had in him. But it was tangled up with the hurt of every unanswered question, every birthday missed, every moment my mother had to stand in for both parents. "What truth?" I asked, my voice sharper now. He hesitated, his gaze flicking again to the people milling around us, the reporters still snapping photos, the families touring the building. "This isn't the place," he said again. "When you're ready, you'll find me." And before I could say anything else, he stepped back, blending into the crowd with the same ease he'd once disappeared from my life. I stood there, staring at the spot where he'd been, the photograph still in my hand, my fingers pressed against the words on the back, as if holding them harder might make them give up their meaning. Alexander didn't speak right away. He just stayed beside me, the way someone does when they know no words can fix what's just happened. Finally, he said quietly, "You don't have to decide anything about him right now." Not today, I nodded, but my mind was already spinning. Because as much as I wanted to ignore my father, as much as I wanted to shove that photograph in a drawer and never look at it again, I knew I wouldn't. Those 4 words, "She didn't tell you," echoed in my head like a clock I couldn't silence. If my father was telling the truth, then there was something about my past I didn't know. And I wasn't sure I was ready for the answers. His debt to me was paid, but ours was a bond that couldn't be measured. Some debts are numbers on paper, others are written in moments that change who you are. Ours would never fit into a ledger. The weeks after the medical center's opening passed in a blur of motion and progress. The building, once a blueprint and a dream, had become a living, breathing part of the town. The reception area was always full. Mothers holding sleeping babies, elderly couples reading in the waiting room, teenagers flipping through their phones while they waited for checkups. Walking through the halls, I could hear the rhythm of it all, the hum of machines, the soft murmur of doctors conferring, the occasional burst of laughter from the pediatric wing. It was everything Alexander had promised, and more. I made it a habit to be there most days, not because my role required it, but because I couldn't stay away. The staff had quickly learned my name, and the patients had begun to recognize me too. Sometimes they'd stop me just to say thank you, not realizing how many people it had taken to make this place possible. One afternoon, as I was reviewing a proposal for an outreach program, Alexander appeared in my office doorway. He was dressed in his usual sharp suit, but there was an ease in his posture, a quiet satisfaction. "Busy?" he asked. "Always," I replied with a small smile. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I came to tell you something. My debt to you. I consider it paid." The words caught me off guard. For months, repayment had been the thread connecting our lives. The medicine at the pharmacy, the dinner, the mansion, the medical center. It had all been framed as his way of giving back for that one moment when I'd stepped forward to help. But now, hearing him say it was paid felt strangely final, like the closing of a chapter I wasn't sure I wanted to end. "I didn't do any of this expecting repayment," I said slowly. "I know," he replied. "That's why it mattered. But you've built something here that will outlast both of us. You took what I gave you and made it bigger than I could have alone. That's worth more than any debt." There was a warmth in his voice, but also a weight, the kind that comes when someone is about to change the terms of your relationship forever. "I'm not walking away," he added quickly, as if sensing my unspoken worry. "I meant what I said the night we met for dinner. I'm your friend. That's permanent, No contracts, no debts, no conditions. The tension in my shoulders eased. Good, because I wasn't planning to stop bothering you anytime soon. He smiled at that, then reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sleek folder. In fact, he said, I have something for you. A job offer. I blinked. I already have a job, running this center. This isn't instead of that, he said. It's in addition. I want you as a senior advisor in my company. You'd work directly with me, overseeing community impact projects. You've proven you can take an idea and turn it into something real. I need more of that in my world. I opened the folder. Inside was an offer letter with a salary that made my head spin, along with a list of responsibilities that read more like opportunities than obligations. It wasn't just a position. It was a seat at his table, a chance to help steer the future of his empire toward something that mattered. You're serious, I said, glancing up at him. Completely. I leaned back in my chair, letting the idea settle. Months ago, I couldn't have imagined being part of his world. Now, the thought of turning this down felt unthinkable. I'll do it, I said finally. His smile widened, but before either of us could say more, there was a knock at the door. A young woman stepped in, not a patient, not a staff member, but a stranger with a press badge clipped to her lapel. Sorry to interrupt, she said, her voice carrying a mix of excitement and urgency. My name is Claire Dawson. I'm a reporter with the Chronicle. I've been following your story, the medical center, the connection between you two, and I think the public is about to hear all of it. I exchanged a glance with Alexander. His expression didn't change much, but I could see the faint narrowing of his eyes, the subtle shift in his stance. What do you mean? I asked. Claire stepped further into the room, lowering her voice as if what she was about to say was meant only for us. Let's just say, someone's been talking, and what's coming out isn't just about the center. It's personal. The words settled between us like a weight. I didn't know what story she thought she had, or who had given it to her. But one thing was clear. Whatever she was about to reveal, it could change everything. What began with a small act of kindness became a legacy. One decision, one rainy afternoon, had reshaped the course of my life. And as I stood in the place where it all began, I realized we were just getting started. The news article dropped on a Tuesday morning, and by Wednesday afternoon, the world seemed to know our names. Claire Dawson's piece was more than a story. It was a portrait, one that captured not only the facts, but the heart behind them. The photograph that led the article showed Alexander and me standing in front of the medical center, sunlight spilling across the silver letters above the entrance. Inside, the words told the unlikely truth. A woman in a small-town pharmacy helping a stranger with his medicine, never knowing he was a billionaire CEO who would repay her in ways no one could have imagined. I braced for criticism, for whispers about motives, for speculation about why he'd chosen me. But the response was overwhelmingly different. Instead of cynicism, there was hope. People saw themselves in the II story. By the end of the first week, my email inbox was overflowing. Messages came from across the globe. A woman in rural India who had started a free clinic in her village after reading about us. A retired firefighter in Australia who began organizing blood drives in his community. A group of university students in Canada who launched a campaign to cover medical bills for uninsured patients. It wasn't just that people were inspired, they were acting. This is it, Alexander said one morning as we sat in his office, the city skyline stretching out behind him. This is what I wanted from the beginning. Not just one building, but a movement. And it became exactly that. Within months, plans were underway for 2 new medical centers, one in a struggling industrial city in the Midwest, another in a remote coastal town that had been without a hospital for decades. Alexander insisted I be at the table for every meeting, every decision. We flew to each site, meeting with community leaders, walking the grounds where walls would rise, listening to what each place truly needed. In the Midwest city, it was a strong trauma unit. In the coastal town, it was a birthing center and a pediatric wing. Everywhere we went, I saw the same pattern. At first, skepticism. People had been promised help before and left with nothing but broken foundations and faded banners. But when the walls started going up, when they saw equipment arriving, doctors interviewing, staff training, the doubt gave way to belief. We didn't just replicate the first center. We adapted each one to fit the heartbeat of its community. And that was Alexander's genius. He knew that no two towns were the same, but kindness could fit anywhere. Somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling like I was just fulfilling someone else's vision. I started feeling like it was ours. The medical center in my hometown had been the seed, but these new ones, and the ones that would follow, were the branches stretching outward. One afternoon, after we'd returned from visiting the coastal site, I found myself walking through the pediatric wing of our first center. Children's laughter spilled from the play area. Nurses moved like a well-rehearsed orchestra, calm and precise. Parents sat in chairs, their shoulders visibly relaxing once they were inside these walls. It was working. All of it. And it was bigger than I'd ever dared to hope. Months passed, and as spring tipped into summer, the pace only accelerated. We were in constant motion, planning, building, hiring. The work was exhausting, but it felt like oxygen. Then, one gray afternoon, heavy with rain, I decided to take a walk through town alone. My feet led me without thinking toward the place where it had all begun. The small pharmacy with its scuffed tile floors and faded blue awning. The glass doors looked the same. The neon open sign flickered faintly against the damp sky. I stood across the street for a long moment, letting the memories come. The elderly man fumbling for coins, the tense silence as the pharmacist waited, the feel of the worn bills in my hand as I stepped forward. I didn't know why I'd come here today, only that it felt important. Maybe it was to remind myself that all the grand openings, the board meetings, the travel, all of it traced back to something so small. The rain began to fall in earnest, cool drops soaking into my hair and coat. I tilted my face upward, closing my eyes for a moment and listening to the patter on the pavement. Footsteps approached, steady and unhurried. "You always did have a thing for dramatic weather," Alexander's voice teased gently. I turned, smiling despite the chill. He stood there holding a black umbrella, dressed in a charcoal overcoat that made him look like he'd stepped out of another world. His presence was the same as it had been from the beginning, solid, certain, yet somehow still surprising. "What are you doing here?" I asked. "Thought I'd see where you disappeared to," he replied, stepping closer so the umbrella covered us both. Figured this was the only place that made sense. We stood there together, looking at the pharmacy. A couple walked out, huddled under a jacket against the rain. A young boy held a paper bag of medicine, skipping ahead of his mother. Life moved on. But for me, this was the ground zero of 1,000 ripples. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been here that day?" I asked quietly. Alexander's gaze didn't leave the building. "I do. And every time, I realize there's no point imagining it. Because we were here. Because you acted. And everything that's followed. This, the centers, the lives changed. All of it came from that." The rain eased into a mist, soft and lingering. Across the street, a young woman stepped forward to help an elderly man with his bag, holding her coat over his head as they walked toward their car. I couldn't help but smile. "Looks like it's contagious," I said. "That's the point," Alexander replied. Then he turned to me, his expression shifting, lighter, but with the kind of certainty that comes before a big decision. "So, ready for the next chapter?" I let my gaze drift back to the pharmacy one last time, feeling the weight of the years between that first rainy afternoon and this one. My hair was damp, my coat heavy with water, but inside I felt light, ready. I met his eyes, my smile certain. "I am." We started walking, leaving the pharmacy behind us. The rain faded into the distance, replaced by the steady rhythm of our footsteps. Ahead lay the work, the challenges, the unknowns, but also the promise of what could be built when kindness was the blueprint. His words, the next chapter, stayed with me as we walked, because I knew now that this wasn't just our story. It was the story of every person who had been touched by a small act of kindness, and everyone yet to come. If this story touched your heart, don't let it be the last. Subscribe now to join me on more journeys where kindness changes lives in ways you never expect. Share your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone, and pass this video along to someone who needs a reminder